Welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. I am joined by Polly, aka Shadowban Refugee, again. And for the first time on here, Alexander McKay, who I learn a lot from. He's very intelligent. He's the host of Red Star Radio podcast, co hosted with, I believe her name is Layla, right?
Yeah.
And it's great to have you on here, Alex. You want to give us a little bit more of a background to some of the audience here who may not know who you are?
Well, thanks for the invite on, Franco. It's good to be here. Been doing Red Star Radio in its current form for just over a year now. We started off because I think both me and my co-host Layla, who lives up in Ontario, we met over Twitter as two Marxists going insane over the fact that barely anybody was developing like a critique of like what was happening with the I would call the COVID regulatory regime that were the
Oh
advanced
yeah.
capitalist nations were putting into place. And really, we started off from the point of view that, well, we better make an attempt to analyze and understand this. Otherwise, the only narrative that's going to be coming out is going to be people who are more on the, should we say, more on the sort of the capitalist libertarian side, who are claiming things communism, or from other elements that I don't think shed too much light on it. I still believe that Marxism is a powerful living tool for us to actually apply to the situation. So a lot of our episodes have been dominated by trying to work this out, and like what we've looked at is like what the ideology of like what was called scientism, state bureaucracies, the both the gains of the working class in sort of gaining the vote in across the capitalist world like 100 years ago, and how that's been diminished ever since. How the ruling class in like the American-led capitalist bloc have tried to move as many decisions as possible outside of the field of any remote democratic scrutiny. And I think that, and then also, of course, the opening up of capitalism in China and how important that is, and also then like how what that impact has had in terms of some of the major events of the last 20 years, which are like the war on terror and what the how that prefigured a lot of what's come down the pipe with the COVID regime, what the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years, then Iraq has taught us, how this is all part of a continuous moving picture where power is concentrated in smaller and smaller areas away from any kind of scrutiny, how the working class is relentlessly oppressed and the ruling class attempts to atomize people relentlessly, increase the elements of alienation and despair in society deliberately so to keep people from actually organizing together to mount any kind of class-based resistance. And all of that, in summary, is like what has created the COVID picture and the COVID regulatory regime. That, extreme cuts to like health services, the desperation of politicians to cover up those cuts, the desperation of them to avoid having to actually take any accountability for their actions, obviously. And the failures also, we've discussed a lot of like the left, which are on display almost every single day, from everything from COVID to the truckers dispute, which we're going to, I think, go on to discuss. So that's the
Yeah.
picture of what we've been doing. I think whether we meant to do it or not, what we've been ended up doing is like trying to break out of like the very narrow way in which Marxism has been considered and tried to be applied by the so-called Marxist groups in my country and Canada, America, and the United States. Because really, since the global economic crisis of 2008, it's been like the Marxist groups have been revealed to be useless and impotent. And they had huge opportunities to make an advance in 2008 to about 2012, failed. Then there was the Trump thing and the Brexit thing, didn't do anything with that, just sided with part of the ruling class and got hysterical about so called fascists or Russian infiltrators. And now again, calling a bunch of working class Canadians racist for standing up for basic democratic freedoms. So clearly, those of us who believe that Marxism has a is a valuable tool for the organized worker or the disorganized worker need to actually make an effort to reclaim that from the bullshit artists. So I hope that we've been playing some kind of role in doing that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can tell you firsthand, I've learned a lot from you. Shadow Band here has learned a lot. Same with Jack Sith, who hopefully will join us in a little bit. He can't stop referencing you. He's learned so much from you. And there's a few people in the audience here who are really excited to have you on here. So it's a pleasure to have you on, Alex. Now,
Good to hear the news from the rain-soaked northwest of England.
yeah, I want to
That sounds
get.
nice. I live in the desert, man.
I live in the belly of the beast, or just like right by the belly of the beast
All right.
in Washington D.C.
All right. Well, be careful that AOC doesn't have you arrested for possession of a threatening Twitter feed.
Oh goodness gracious! I've confronted her already twice.
I saw that, man.
Yeah,
That was good.
thank you. No, I wanted to get your perspective, Alex, as a Marxist, and Polly, your perspective as a former Marxist, current anarchist, about the truckers' convoy, which I've discussed here already a few times, criticizing a lot of anti-imperialist leftist positions about how they believe that this is a right-wing co-option, that we shouldn't be backing these people up because there are Nazis at the protests. It's not the type of working class people we should be associating ourselves with. So, what is your guys' take on this convoy?
Well,
After you.
thank you, sir. I'll say first of all, I mean, my co-host Layla's been out there in Ottawa, like directly supporting them and talking to truckers. She did a piece for the Unheard, a news site in England the other day, where she interviewed one of these guys. Like, look, these are regular working guys from across the whole spectrum of like the Canadian working class. I mean, let's deal with some of the myths. I think first of all, like we also spoke to a Canadian American trucker, Gordon McGill, who's recently been banned from Twitter for telling too much truth, I think. And like he outlined some of the issues to us, which was that the trucking industry in Canada and the United States been under attack. Workers in it have been under attack for a very long time. Like the conditions are getting worse. The employers are like ever clamping down on like paying conditions. Like this whole vaccine mandate thing was just one more thing on the whole stack of things that pushed them to the point where they thought, well, we're going to say no, which always happens when the ruling class hit the working class in the face over and over again. Eventually, someone says no. And also, like you've been seeing like leftist big name accounts on Twitter saying, "Oh, well, they're not
Yeah.
real workers because some of them own their rigs." Well, we spoke to Gord about that. Speak to some of the other truckers about that. Like owning like the vehicle you make a living off. Yeah, it means that you've got. Sometimes you might own it outright. Sometimes you might have like certain interests in it. You might have borrowed the money to actually be able to say that you bought it. Or you might be like an owner operator the same way an Uber driver is. Like there's a multitude of levels at operation there. You can't dismiss somebody as not a real worker just because like they might own or part own the thing that they use to make their money. Also, the fact that like they own their own means of production, so to speak, like that doesn't mean that they are not that the point that they are standing for is not correct. And the point that they are standing for, quite simply, is that the state and the employer shouldn't have the right to mandate substances that are put into your person. That's a pretty fundamental right, given that the vaccine mandate is based on two false assumptions from the government, one of which is that by being vaccinated, you can't spread it anymore. Totally false. We've seen that over and over again. Israel's on the fourth booster now. Pretty sure they'll be on the fifth soon. And again, record rates of infection, and also that you can't get sick with COVID. Well, I've known numerous people, like just in my own direct circle, who've had 3 of these things and got sick with it. So again, 2 false premises that they're basing the policy on. And I can't believe that I can't believe it, that we're at the point where certain people claiming to be Marxists, leftists, whatever they want to call themselves, are now saying that they want to give the federal Canadian government or the federal American government the right to dictate to workers what medical treatments that they should have. That for something which is completely disproportionate and you can't justify forcing people to take this. And in my view, I've gone a lot further on this from when I started out. I don't think you can ever justify that. I don't think you can. I think that if you believe in the human capacity for reason and rational judgment, and if you believe that the working class should become the ruling class, which I do believe, then you have to see reason and rationality being something which every person is fundamentally capable of, even if the world we're living in now doesn't allow them to develop that to the full quite a lot of the time. And I believe that if you show a bunch of workers and can demonstrate to them the benefit of taking a particular medicine, 80–90% of them will take it. The 10% that won't, for whatever reason, religious, spiritual, whatever, wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. So this authoritarian madness that's the state and the employers in Canada and the United States are trying to impose on workers. If you're any kind of socialist, from a social democrat through to an anarchist, and every tradition is disgracing themselves at the moment, you need to oppose that en masse, because I do not see any justification for siding with the state and the employers on this, and then continuing the errors by lying about who the truckers are, by lying and saying that it's some kind of Nazi-dominated KKK rally, as if there's a K. I didn't realize there was a Canadian KKK. It must be something that's passed me by, or that the whole thing was like set up and stitched up by the Koch brothers, or that the sort of right-wing American interests were behind it. I'll just conclude on this point by saying that, like, look, the Koch brothers and like various like shady billionaires, they wish they could conjure up a movement out of nothing. They can't. The bourgeoisie cannot make thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of ordinary workers suddenly take a stand. Now, yes, government agencies, law enforcement, various dodgy billionaire interests, yeah, they can manipulate a working class protest if it doesn't take a clear political direction and the field becomes open to them. They can't create it. And this is like the fallacy that Mr. Ben Norton was putting out there.
Yeah.
The idea that, oh, it's astroturf. Like, no, I don't think he knows what astroturfing means. And I don't think he has any respect for ordinary American and Canadian workers, because you can't conjure this mood up out of nowhere. Trust me, I've looked at the history. Plenty of billionaires have tried to conjure up a movement out of nothing. They can't do it because their way of doing politics doesn't appeal to the working class. They only get the chance to manipulate it if a clear working class political force doesn't start influencing things and getting the thing on a more proletarian basis, politically speaking. So it's a series of fallacies, it's a series of lies designed around to justify their continued support for the actions of the state and the employers, and they have to cover that up by pretending this is some sort of progressive in response to some dire threat. They're all basically just talking completely out of their asses, and they're all in a desperate attempt to cover up the fact that they've abandoned critical analysis and they've taken an anti-worker position.
Yeah, I would actually totally agree. I never thought I would see the day that self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninists would be going after workers that own their own means of their production. So, like, some of my Twitter spats have been, so I'm a tradesman, right? And so I therefore do own the tools of my trade. And apparently that makes me a self-employed artisan, even though I'm an hourly employee and part of in a labor organization. But more importantly, it's, for me, and from my perspective, it's become a very popular term, the mass formation, right? And the word psychosis is a bit of a stigmatism, right? Like it's a bit of a stigmatized term, but there's this mass formation now that's been happening in those that are well-meaning people, that they're waiting to get their opinions from other people, and then they're jumping on that bandwagon, right? And that's why you have this anti-working people sentiment, right? And I think it's not discussed enough that truckers have been hit really, really hard over the past 2 years, right? Well, so if you're a private contractor and you own your own rig, or you have it financed or whatever, that means that you have to put out a set bid for delivering any particular truck, and any particular load. And you can't really bid that when the inflation of fuel is through the fucking roof. Like, that's not just monetary inflation, that's asset price inflation, right? But you can't really bid for it too when you have when you go to a port and your port is so backed up that you have to wait. So now you're waiting for days at a time to get your rig loaded so that you can deliver the goods. So they've actually seen their wages decrease just as much as any any hourly employee or whatever of a massive corporation. And even it hurts them more, right? I think it hurts them more because my former industry, I was in the fueling industry, right? And so I talked to a lot of truckers because I was working on a whole lot of truck stops, and a lot of those guys, they're living load to load because it's really hard to compete with multinational corporations that get subsidized benefits from not only the state but also like EPA and all kinds of there's all kinds of regulatory capture that goes into that. You get certain tax subsidies if you have a certain amount of your fleet vehicles that are somewhat green or whatever. And then there's also the fact that yes, a lot of these rigs are financed, and they're not cheap financed rigs, right? Like they're 200, 300K. And most rigs now are being built with planned obsolescence anyway. So you're having to put in $100,000 repairs on the thing that you have financed, right? And so you're just constantly building yourself more and more and more and more into debt. So that's the whole real situation, I think, at least, of these people standing up and saying no. And then farmers, that's the other half of this, right? Like the sickle of the hammer and sickle. People seem to believe that if someone owns a tractor or has a tractor financed or owns the land that they farm off of, that there's some type of petty bourgeois. And I live in a farm town. I moved to a farm town because the city was just way too fucking expensive. Farming is not a lavish fucking life, man. Like, they're heavily in debt. And they're also being hammered by tax at an alarming rate. And they really can't compete with these multinational land speculators that buy land and then automate all of their stuff through tax subsidies and are part of the big ag, right? And you're always, as a farmer, you are always half a bad harvest away from complete and total ruin, foreclosure, repossession, and everything else, right? And that also kind of goes into like drought and like the issues that we've been having, at least in my sector of the states, that a lot of causeways have been locked and you can only irrigate so much because the state told you that we're in a drought and you can't irrigate your farm. Well, if you can't irrigate your farm, you can't produce the product. And if you can't produce the product, then you can't sell the product. And if you can't sell the product, then they're going to come and take your shit. They're going to come and seize your means of production, right? And then they're going to give it to someone like Bill Gates. And then in 2019 as well, there was that inland hurricane that just destroyed crops all over Iowa and Idaho and shit. So a lot of those people are already in dire straits. And so this undialectical, if I can use that term, undialectical way of looking at things that, I got told by the media that these aren't workers, they're all petty bourgeois or whatever. It's really alarming. And as opposed to, and with regards to the mandates, especially, like, there's no scientific basis for it. There's absolutely no scientific basis for it. Mm-hmm. And there are people that are having to face an ultimatum of financial ruin, foreclosure, and repossession of their stuff. And this is all industries, including mine. Or taking something that could make them sick, allegedly, And that is a very scary ultimatum, right? Like, and so, and something else that really needs to be addressed here is that labor organizations management and labor organizations members are not the same fucking thing. We do not agree with our management probably about 87% of the time. Little story from my local, we had working dues at 5%. And we voted as a local to drop them back down to 2% as they used to be. Well, we had to get permission from our international organization, our IO office, and they told us no. Mm-hmm. So, because they are able to funnel money into certain places and certain political campaigns, and then there's that pay-to-play corruption that comes into play. And so this idea that because this particular labor organization management put out this bulletin that says 90% of our people are vaccinated and everyone's happy to be vaccinated and we all want to be vaccinated and therefore these people are anti-worker is anti-membership, because we don't fucking agree with our fucking management. And more often than not, we're at odds with our bureaucrats in our own locals just as much as we are with the management of the companies that we work for. So, I mean, everything's kind of been flipped on its head, and really just, it's very simple. People have the right to say no to a medical fucking procedure. They just do.
When it comes to these economic theories here that we're going to discuss, first, I want to thank Sarah Wagner for the tip on Brockfin. Thank you very much. That's really appreciated. But we can start by comparing neoliberal economic policy with Marxism economic policy in the context of what we're discussing here with the Canadian truckers. And then we can bring in Keynesian economics in a little bit. But is this the reason for why some quote-unquote anti-imperialist leftists are against this movement? Is this because of the power of neoliberal economic influence? Like, it can influence the media, the way that information is distributed, the way that we are brought up, and how messages are ingrained in us, and the way that we view our world from an early age. Is that what has influenced a lot of anti-imperialist or Marxist thinkers into being against this convoy? Because shouldn't this and Alexander McKay made this point in a tweet recently, isn't what Lenin said is we have to go wherever the workers are, and it shouldn't matter what their economic ideology is, right? It should be an opportunity there to spread the message, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you say? What do you think about that? Is this the power of neoliberal economics influencing and preventing people from seeing clearly what Marxism economic theory should be?
I think it's several things. I think that first of all, a lot of them born after the late 60s. You haven't seen a successful mass workers movement in your life in Britain, or I don't think in the United States either. Certainly, if you're born from like the early 80s, you've only ever grown up with knowledge of like defeats and disasters. So a lot of people came to understand their understanding of Marxism at a time of unprecedented reactionary politics, working class defeat, and a profound pessimism, even amongst Marxists, about what the working class would actually be capable of, politically speaking. And that reflects in like a lot of the analysis, like especially if you come from a more middle class background or live in a middle class bubble, like these people don't regard fundamentally the working class as being capable of rationality and reason. And that shows in their pronouncements about this. The other thing is that they have misidentified and made a very bad theoretical mistake regarding the role of the capitalist state. And we were talking about this before we started the stream. I think that for a lot of people in Britain and the Anglosphere countries, they look at like the rhetoric of like what's called the neoliberal period. You look at like a Reagan or a Thatcher saying, we must roll back the state and stuff like that. And they think that that was actually what happened. That isn't what happened in that period. The state was not rolled back because the capitalists can't roll back the state, because the whole reason that it exists in its current form is as a management structure to administer capitalism and to keep the working class suppressed. And they can't do without that structure. And so when like Thatcher and Reagan said, we're going to roll back the state and let the market rip and all that kind of stuff, there was a reconfiguration of state functions in the 80s and 90s by those particular leaders, by Thatcher, Reagan, Clinton, Blair. But the actual core functions of the state, its repressive organs, its administrative function, the very important role like the finance ministries and central banks play in administering capitalism, that didn't change. In fact, that got enhanced. The state bureaucracies at their higher level got enhanced and grew. What was cut was actually what little the working class got out of the state from the concessions made after World War II. And so when people are looking at this, I'll use the American context as an example. A lot of American leftists spent for the last 6 years, from 2016 with the first Bernie Sanders campaign till recently, saying we need Medicare for all, we need Medicare for all, we need the state to run the healthcare system. And then when they couldn't get that, and the Bernie campaign crashes into a crater and then just comes out and says, vote Joe Biden, you're left with a whole layer of people who had been saying Medicare for all, state-run medicine, we want an NHS-style system for years. And they suddenly, from that defeat, turned around and embraced like the COVID regime and even vaccine mandates, I think, as a substitute for state-run medicine. They were prepared to basically, the state wasn't going to give them Medicare for all, but they would give them vaccine mandates. And because they think they've made a theoretical mistake in thinking that the state and the market are separate actors, are separate forces, not two things which are wrapped around each other like two strands of DNA. And unlike the libertarians who think that you can have capitalism without the state, you can't, or have somehow the state counterposed to capitalism, you can't. The state is there to create and recreate the systems of exploitation and accumulation, because the capitalists can't do that on their own. Because the state performs this important function of not just the exercise of naked power, but the legitimation of that power. You know, if the landowner, as was, you just paid a bunch of armed thugs to come around and beat up the tenant farmers when they didn't pay their rent on time, or to evict people from the land, that might provoke a more violent, militant response from the farmers and the occupants of the land, or workers in a factory, than if some guy with a badge on, acting with the authority of a supposedly democratic state, turns up and says, I'm an officer of the law, and you've been told under subsection B of the Public Order Act that you've got to disperse this demonstration or face arrest, or face being taken to court and face a massive fine being levied on you and your property being confiscated. Well, that's a different and much more useful thing for capital at this stage anyway, than a bunch of paid armed thugs turning up and beating the hell out of people. That's an important legitimation function which the state serves to capitalism. And without that, their rule is a lot more difficult and dangerous. So most of the British and American left don't understand that distinction. They look at what Thatcher and Reagan said, and Clinton, and said, well, the state's retreated. Well, states retreated, therefore we need more state function to combat the market. We need you see this all the time with like liberals on Twitter saying, we need an enhanced EPA, we need a bigger FDA, we need more spending in these particular areas. Not realizing, of course, that these are all organs of for the administration of capitalism, and to create more areas for capital accumulation and to legitimate that capital accumulation and exploitation. So it comes from, to go back to your question, Franco, it comes from a misunderstanding of what the Neoliberal Period is, and a misunderstanding about what the role of the state is, and misunderstanding the fact that the so-called Neoliberal Period was a period of the ruling class having to respond to a deep crisis that set in British and American capitalism from the 60s onwards, needing to increase the exploitation of the domestic working class to get out of that problem, that crisis of profitability. and needing to reorganize the state in order for them to do so. And not understanding that role, not understanding the role of the state, is why we're in this situation with so many Marxists around saying, oh, well, you've got to be right wing to oppose vaccine mandates. So you've got to be a conspiracy theorist to point out glaringly obvious things about the FDA, or the drug approvals process in Britain, or the bureaucratic management of the health system, or the fact that so many capitalist interests have got their claws in the health system, even the so-called public health system. This all comes from, at root, a misunderstanding of the role of the state under capitalism. And once you've made that mistake, then you end up supporting all kinds of heinous reactionary shit because you think state equals positive, anti-market, against the market. And fucking the adoration of people like Sanders and Corbyn doesn't help, because when Bernie Sanders goes on the TV and says democratic socialism is the fire department and the police, well, great, you just cursed a whole generation with the worst understanding of socialism possible. Thanks, Senator. And Corbyn, similar thing, though in fairness to him, he's a little bit more on the libertarian side on the whole vaccine passport thing. But I think that's, to answer your question, that's where a lot of this mistakes come from.
Yeah, Paulie, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. And in my organized labor article, I tried to point this out, is that capital, the state, and at least our labor organizations as they've come to be in the United States, at least. I don't know everywhere else. North America, I'd say in general, because most Canadian labor organizations are also in league with the American ones, right? AFL-CIO. They exist in a symbiotic nature. They cannot exist without the other, right? And there's this idea, like you stated, that if the state does something, then it must be inherently good, right? Because we've been led to believe that, through a series of propaganda at least, that socialism is when the state does stuff, which is just fucking asinine. And neoliberalism in and of itself is just kind of like, I guess, taking old colonialism and breeding it with monopoly capitalism as it existed 100 years ago, and adding a touch of fascism into the mix, right? It's this new, because traditionally fascism needs a nationalist component, but this is no longer nationalist. This is internationalist, right? This is, well, maybe, okay, not internationalist, it's global. I try to stay away from the word globalist because people get really mad about the word globalist. And internationalist, what at least used to mean people of the world coming to an understanding with each other that we're all the same, right? But this is a global effort, and when people have this idea that when the state does stuff, that must mean socialism, they're really arguing for their own demise. Because if this is just colonialism rebranded into neoliberalism, where the capital will take what it can by regular market metrics, then the state will take the rest, right? Because people don't seem to understand that the state can be captured by capital interest. And like, through our understanding of regulatory bodies, right, and Keynesianism and all that shit, we've come to this conclusion, like a logical conclusion, I would say, the contradiction. We've come to the antithesis that by building regulatory bodies to regulate capital structures, now the capital structures are now regulating the regulatory bodies, right? So it's an inversion of what it was supposed to be in the first place, right? And I would say that was the plan in the first place. It was a plan enacted 100 years ago that has come to its logical conclusion that they planned for. And there's a certain type of I guess woeful ignorance of how state and capital functions, right? People don't want to use the dialectic as a way to come up with our own 21st century solution. And I mean, capital and the state have done that very adequately, right? And like, that's how we have the WEF. That's how we have young global leaders all over the world in different states and different cabinets and everything, right? It's just capital becoming more and more monopolized and using the state as its bat to bash anyone in the head, right? Because I mean, and this happened, at least in the States, 150 years ago or so in our coal mining revolutions, right? Where the Pinkertons and the Boston Detective Agency failed, or Baltimore Detection Agency failed. The state came in and massacred the people that were rising up. So I think people need to kind of go back to the drawing board and ask themselves, was I wrong about this? Right. And I'm not like a Trotsky worshiper by any stretch of the imagination. I've got plenty of nasty things to say about the guy. But what Trotsky said on the eve of his death about how World War II is going to happen, and we know it's going to happen. And if it doesn't evolve into global revolution, we need to stop and reanalyze everything. And most people refuse to stop and reanalyze everything. So
we were talking a little bit before the stream about mythology, in the sense that people think that they have this idea of what the 1940s were like during Roosevelt's presidency, which I believe was the first time that Keynesian economics was applied in the US. A lot of democratic socialists, like you guys were mentioning earlier, they want to go back to this time in which there is more state intervention to regulate certain businesses from becoming too large. What exactly is Keynesian economics, and was it in fact first applied in the US? Was it created to save capitalism? What exactly is this?
Well, certainly John Maynard Keynes, the English economist who came up with or lent his name to a set of theories which became known as Keynesianism, he certainly saw it as saving capitalism. And to try and wrap it up in a sentence or two, like Keynes, after World War I, starts developing these theories around the idea of the state having a role in demand management or stimulating demand. And that what was needed was for the state to take what he saw as a slightly more active role in like stimulating demand within the economy, particularly to get over the economic problems of the 1920s and into the 1930s. And like this idea being that if you stimulated demand amongst the middle class and to a certain extent the working class via various different means, that came to include in the Roosevelt period, like vast public infrastructure projects or slight certain increases in wages, that the increased demand would help stabilize the system. And by actually acting in this way, the state could actually help to trim off some of the worst excesses and destabilizing effects of capitalism as it had existed prior to the 1930s, and certainly into the 1930s as well, with how the Great Depression played out. So it's based around this idea of the state being more open in its intervention in the economy, trying to do certain things to stimulate consumer demand with the belief that that will generate further growth in the economy. And that's my nutshell explanation of it. And it became accepted practice in most advanced capitalist nations from the 30s onwards, that you would need greater state intervention in order to stimulate demand in the economy. I mean, the fascist states did that in the 1930s. Infamously, the Hitler regime did do quite a bit, considerable amount of state direction and intervention in the economy to actually promote economic growth by public works projects being one of them, vast armament spending being the other, with the idea that this would generate greater profits, that it would employment, that therefore the employers will employ more people, therefore more workers will be in employment, therefore more workers will spend money, therefore greater demand, therefore greater profits, and the cycle goes onwards. The issue is, of course, that many of the Keynesians, particularly as we go into like the 1960s, and one of the theorists we cite a lot on the show is Belgian Marxist called Ernest Mandel, called it like the era of like techno-rationality in capitalist states. This idea that there would be this sort of the state would play a role in managing the economy and through sort of Keynesian economic demand side management methods, and that this would help stabilize capital. Of course, it didn't, because no amount of the capitalist state trying to stimulate certain sectors of the economy, trying to spend a little bit more here, a little bit more there, can overcome the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which is the contradiction between a vast and exploited work class and a very small class of exploiters. That central contradiction can't be overcome by the state stimulating the economy in certain ways or trying to manage it in certain ways. And nor could it solve the contradictions of imperialism. So like Keynesianism, the Keynesian regime in the United States starts to die off really as a definitive period around about 1965, when after 20 years of relatively high growth rates in the United States and Britain, capitalism suddenly its rate the profits go off the edge of a cliff in 1965. And then you go into a period of profound destabilization where Nixon does away with the gold standard, Britain joins the European Union, various other things happen where they try to reorganize themselves to find new ways of hyper-exploiting the working class, first of all. And Keynesianism kind of dies a death, but doesn't really die off completely then, because the idea of demand stimulation is still there. It's still there in the policymakers' toolkit. They used it extensively after 2008. They're always using the state to try and stimulate demand via usually gigantic corporate subsidies, which they somehow think, or some of them claim to think, that will mean more investment when the corporations just take it, buy back their own stock, boost their own prices, and give themselves a payout. The problem for the people you were mentioning, Franco, the social democrats, people like your DSA in the United States or Labour Party leftists in Britain, is that they look back at that period with the state taking more of an interventionist role and think, well, that was better. Mm-hmm. But, well, in certain areas, life did improve. I'm not going to lie about that. Like my parents' generation, born immediately after World War II, yeah, they were better off than their parents before that. But that was because of an extremely strong British working class movement and the example of the Russian Revolution scaring the ruling class enough into actually delivering a few incidents, but not as many as the mythology says. And also things like our healthcare system, which does benefit the working class. Even that, if you look back on how it's actually funded, not this old myth that like your Kyle Kalinskis like to babble on about 90% tax rates, mostly a lie. Never really happened in the way that people like him say it was. What happened was the public services that we got in that period, a huge amount of it was paid for, first of all, by imperialism, by hyper-exploiting, in our case, places like Malaysia for their rubber industry, places like Kenya, places like South Africa, and also increased exploitation of the working class at home through increased productivity of labor, but also through indirect taxation, sales taxes, consumption taxes, that kind of thing. You look at the studies of it and you see that the bulk of those public sector concessions to the working class was just a recycling of money that the working class was paying in consumption taxes anyway. So like, again, we go back to mythology. People are now, a lot of things have been dumbed down to such a degree that they look at it and think, Well, that was better. Let's try and do it again. But it's not possible or desirable to go back, is my argument. You know, with capital has gone beyond the stage where like relatively controlled a relatively controlled period where they could have some stability. That's all gone now. With the disappearance of the old, what used to be called actually existing socialism, Berlin Wall goes down, Soviet Union goes, China converts to capitalism. Capital can go anywhere now. It could do anything. The period of stability from like the 40s to the late 70s is not possible because that was also contingent upon a whole area of the world being sealed off to capitalism. Now it can go anywhere and do anything. That level of stability just isn't possible now. So we've got greater exploitation the world over. We've got greater instability the world over. And of course, the capitalist state's responding by ever greater repression at home and more imperialism abroad. So, like every kind of formulation that made that sort of Keynesian managed state possible is now all gone. And we can't go back to it, basically. And so that's why I would say that the crucial thing for us to do, one of the crucial things for us to do, is to be able to critique that properly, to talk to people who have been influenced by the DSA and say, look, here's the reality of that period. We can't go back to it. And it wasn't that great anyway. So let's stop with the rose-tinted glasses about what Roosevelt might have done if he'd lived another 5 years or something, and start dealing with the reality of American capitalism now, which is not a pretty reality, but I'd rather face that than start, getting misty-eyed over the 1940s.
Yeah, the phrase "evolve with the times" comes to mind. Right? We can't ever go back to how things were. New problems have arisen. We have to apply present day solutions to present day problems, right, Polly?
Yeah. And I mean, so it kind of brings to mind like an abusive relationship, right? Like people in abusive relationships often say, well, if we just went back to the time that like when we first got together and nothing was doing and nothing was happening like this, then everything would be fine, right? Because we have a tendency to idealize things of the past, especially because there's a woeful ignorance of the way that things actually were in the past. And I totally agree with you that like the hyper exploitation overseas really buttressed Keynesianism in general, right? Like especially after World War II, when the old empires were shattered and everything was basically up for grabs, right? And then like technological innovation came into that, and there was more resources that needed to be exploited for the technological exploitation, right? So being that we're stuck in this idea of if we just go back to the way things were, then everything would be fine. There's no room to progress and use dialectics, and then that creates also a certain type of mass formation where people want to just jump on the bandwagon, right? As far as Keynesianism goes, I mean, it ran its course and was dealt its first death blow in the 70s when we moved to a completely monetary system, and then in 2008 when QE came around, right? Because by all metrics, capital interests failed fucking miserably, leading us to the crashes in the 70s, and then the big crash in 2008, right? The housing crisis, and QE basically, I think QE took Keynesianism to its logical conclusion, which is they just get as much fucking money as they possibly can get, and Keynesianism was a way, in theory, was a way to decentralize capital interests. But instead, it actually did the exact opposite, and now it's a completely centralized capital interest system that we live in, right? We don't have competing We don't have competing corporations. We don't have competing nations. We don't have competing really anything. They're all operating in concert with each other, through the power of the state, of course, to further to further the centralization until they own and control absolutely everything, right? And the monetary system is a way to do that, especially when the dollar is the world reserve currency. People seem to forget that if we have a world reserve currency by the dollar, then everything on this planet is tied to U.S. capital interests, right? So it's a completely centralized system. And if it's centralized, we have to start asking, is it planned? Are they planning these certain things in such a way that the crashes, the pumps and the dumps, right? The market cycle that's supposed to happen organically is actually being planned in certain events. And you can kind of see it when they pass certain laws and pass certain legislation. But you're right. We can't go back. And I feel like when people argue to go back, they're willing to lie to themselves about how things were really good back then, right? And mass movements have a tendency to lose themselves, and become just a mob, right? And like I people seem to still think that we can reform the system, and there's no real way to reform what they have planned out. So we don't even technically live in a market system anymore, right? There's no the market as an institution is just another tool by international bureaucrats that can be either organically or inorganically slated to further their interests, right? There's no market metrics to explain this anymore, right? Like in through reading Capital, you can learn a whole lot about apples, right? It's a little inside Marxist joke, but I think we have to kind of move past that as the only way to explain this, right? Like this is just centralization. But
now, what about this how do you say it? Romanticizing of other countries. A lot of democratic socialists who, I would say, are more in line with Keynesian economic ideology, romanticize the Nordic countries for their economics. And a lot of people who call themselves Marxists or Marxist-Leninists, not everyone, but a lot of them, romanticize China and their economic structure and their governance. Will this going to the being similar to these countries in the U.S., is that necessarily going to mitigate the problem of imperialism and oppression? What do you guys say to that?
I'd say that be America or Britain being more like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, or China is neither possible or desirable. Because fundamentally, the vision of let's start with the Nordic example. The vision that like people like Sanders presented of like the Nordic countries is a vision that is 40 years out of date. Doesn't exist anymore. Like take Sweden. Sweden's like the big the original like one of the original like social democratic post World War II paradigms, like this idea that you've got this like you had a heavy integration of the labor movement with the state and the employers. You had this mass collective bargaining that took place every year. You had like a very high level of equality for a capitalist nation. That's certainly true. That all started to die in the early 1980s, before, most of us here were possibly even born. So then that died when the employers just turned around and said, in response to a global crisis of capitalism in the early 1980s, we're not doing the collective bargaining anymore. Fuck off, basically. And they found one union to opt out of the collective bargaining, and then their system was broken. Swedish social democracy has been dead for longer than I've been alive, in terms of that was the first blow. Many blows followed since then. There's still elements of it that exist in terms of what the Swedish state provides, in terms maybe more than the American federal government does. But the idea of this high period social democratic state, gone completely. And also, again, if it had been that good, it would have been able to overcome the contradictions of capitalism. It couldn't, because the employers, when they hit a profitability problem, turned around and destroyed it. And the bureaucratic trade union leaders basically just rolled over and died. There was some attempts at struggle from the Swedish working class, but the Swedish Social Democratic Party is just a party dedicated to the management of Swedish capitalism. And it has accepted this inroads in their previous social democratic settlement, to the point where Sweden was leading the way in school privatization and stuff like that. Our conservative politicians were getting ideas from Sweden. And then you look at Denmark now run by a very right-wing, pro-NATO, pro-American imperialist party that wears the name social democracy. Which in reality is just another party of imperialism, a party of capitalism. It's basically they've spent years again shredding out the social democratic concessions to the working class, and then turning around and saying, you know what? It's the immigrants' fault. All those Afghans that Denmark helped displace by helping the US and Britain to blow up their country for 40 plus years. Then they end up over here. Yeah, it's their fault. Blame them. Or Norway, which is basically a sovereign wealth fund based on its gigantic oil reserves. Not a lot of countries in the world have access to that. Finland, similar story. Once had all these concessions based on fear of the domestic ruling class of a potential revolutionary situation and the strength of the domestic working class. Most of that has been shredded now. So the thing that Sanders and others were putting forward doesn't exist anymore. Hasn't existed for many decades in most cases, and I don't think would be possible to apply to the situation in the United States today as it stands, or my own country. And then look at the Chinese example. Well, look, many different takes and interpretations on the Chinese Revolution, which if we get into, well, I hope you've got a week free. But let's just take one turning point as an example. 1976, death of Mao Zedong, and the coming to power of a guy called Deng Xiaoping, who was one of the advocates and leading voices of the opening up of the Chinese economy to external capital investment, a lot of which was funneled through Taiwan, which makes the so-called tension between the two of them over it seem a little bit ridiculous when you consider how much Taiwanese investment goes into the Chinese economy every year. But from the late 70s onwards, the Chinese rulers were inviting European and American capital to come in and to reap profits from hyper-exploitation of the Chinese working class. There's no doubt about that. It's very well documented. And they did that via progressively turfing off peasants from the land and having them become a hyper-exploitable layer for both domestic Chinese capital, but most specifically in the special economic regions, Taiwanese capital, then American, British, French, German, Italian capital. That's what now, of course, the Chinese state is a more active and interventionist state, apparently it would seem to be, than Britain or America is, because it's still at a lower stage of capitalism. It's still having to develop. It's still trying to develop its domestic industries in a way that isn't just completely dominated by the United States. That doesn't make it any less capitalist. It doesn't make its setup any less of an exploitative system. You go and you look into rebellions amongst Chinese workers, the Chinese peasants, which take place a lot. It's taking place in a way that has started to worry the likes of Xi Jinping, which is why he started to shift his rhetoric around maybe we need to rein in some more of the billionaires, etc. But Chinese Communist Party is full of billionaires. You know, makes the name a bit of a joke. You'll find people on the left justifying it, saying, "Well, the Chinese Communist Party has overseen this record amounts of economic growth." Now, that's true, but I would also say, in response to that, that the when you engage in this method of hyper-industrialization, you throw all these new layers of the former peasantry into exploitation in the factories. There's going to be, even when capitalism did that in its original period in Britain, yeah, living standards of the working class did go up over a period of time, thanks to class struggle largely, and they'll go up thanks to class struggle in China. Again, doesn't make it any less capitalist. It's just at a different stage. The idea that you can model what would happen in the United States on a country which is still, even now, with all its advancements, going through a lower stage of capitalist development, is laughable in my view, and also not desirable. And it's certainly not something that you should be going around telling American workers, oh, you know what, we need to be more like China. That's a politically suicidal thing to do. Aside from being, you know, on a material analysis of the situation in China, it's wrong. And I'll just conclude on the Chinese point by saying that the idea that what they're building in China is a path to socialism, I think, is erroneous. What you're seeing there now developing is a lot of the same problems that American capitalism has. You're seeing like vast property bubbles being blown up. You're seeing you know, things like the Evergrande property company getting into trouble because it essentially engaged in building all this stuff which then nobody could buy. You know, you're seeing them go into them invite Wall Street firms in to develop an internal domestic credit market, to invest in various areas of the Chinese economy. They're on the capitalist road. They have been for over 40 years. And to pretend that there is, again, there's things to learn from it, sure, but you can't apply those in modern day America, which has already gone through that.
Yeah. Yeah, Polly, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a problem that people have with romanticizing anything, and largely that's due to like a centralized media apparatus that tell you, so they have this over here, why can't we have it over here, right? And there's like a certain amount of envy and jealousy that goes into that, but it's also an ignorant fact, because most people don't really want to look into those brass tacks, right? They want to say, "Oh, that looks good," and then I'll take it. Problem with that is that, like you were referring to, Alex, is that the material conditions here are entirely fucking different, and social democracy cannot be divorced from its conquest abroad, and it also cannot be divorced from its ecological disasters as well, right? So like Norway does a whole lot of offshore drilling, which that might be funding quite a bit of their social programs at this time, but if they have a nasty oil spill or a rig blows or something along those lines, there's going to be a whole lot of finger pointing between the state and everything else, and then the subsidies won't be used for the health care or for the or whatever the desired thing that social democracy used to provide for Norwegians. It's going to have to be used to clean up the messes of capitalism at the expense of the working people of Norway, the common people of Norway, right? And there's an issue that we have with, I guess, taking the risk, right? Yes, there's a component of worker ownership or a state that would, having a hard time finding a state that would buttress its working class, but there's also a risk involved with that, and people don't want to address that there's a risk involved with it. So yes, you want more say over the wages that you get, but do you have more say over the risks that are taken by those industries? And I think that that's so divorced from the conversation that people kind of fall up into this trap that they can have their cake and eat it too. So if social democracy is the model that we wish to model ourselves after, then we might want to have a more well-rounded analysis of it. And then there's also the assumption that you can capture the state to work for you, and I don't think it was really built for us, right? And that's a scary it's a scary scenario that you have that would have to be played out. Of, is the state really in it for us? Like, can we make the state work for us because we want these things? And states are in cooperation with each other to keep common people at bay at this point, right? The China thing. I always kind of ask at what cost, right? I hear some people talk about, well, economic development is the key, right? We need economic development, and then we can move past that certain stage. But I'm not really, I'm not into seeing something as the ends justifying the means. Like I bring up an example of in the Soviet Union a lot, because in order to compete with the West, the Soviet Union irrigated a bunch of cotton fields, and dammed a river that used to feed an inland sea in Kazakhstan, right? Well, that's fine and everything, but it also displaced the Kazakhstan culture, and dried up this and dried up the sea, the Aral Sea, or Aral Sea, whatever it is, right? And so in their quest to develop and compete with another system, they destroyed an entire culture of people, right? Like, Kazakhstan's a barren wasteland, because of that. And I think that's a dangerous game to play if we idealize the good things that something else did without taking into account its costs. And the China thing about it, there's plenty of propaganda out there both ways about China, and it's really hard for me to take either one of them as gospel. But as far as like a central organization that was telling people how to farm things and how to produce things, as someone who plans work, that's like my job title. I'm a foreman. Planning cannot catch everything. Best laid plans of mice and men, but also shit comes up. And to have like an ideology that says it can only be planned, and there's no contingency around that plan, and you have to plan your work and work your plan. I think that's a really dangerous thing when you're talking about massive areas of places. Like in real small situations, right? Like, so if I have a building and I plan for the whole building, then yeah, they can somewhat work my plan. But also, as they have a room, things are going to come up and they're going to have to change my plan a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I see like the central committee in China as being vehemently opposed to that. And that's why they had to bring in capitalists, which then exploited that loophole, right? Like I think that kind of shit ran its course too, right? Like, and the theories that social democracy and Marxist-Leninist Maoism put into action, I think they've they've kind of ran their course, and we need to come up with something else in 2022 because the enemy has evolved. So.
Well, just to add, the Aral Sea example is a good one of like the bureaucratic planning process falling on its ass because, Khrushchev had an idea and was insistent upon it. And the problem there is that when you've got a system not of democratic or democratically organized economic planning, which can be responsive to conditions on the ground, as you were pointing out, what you have is a centrally run system of diktats, which eventually not only does it create centers of privilege and power, which eventually try and seize more resources for themselves, but also it's completely unresponsive to the actual needs of the working class, and therefore alienates the working class systematically from it. And this happened a lot in like certainly the later period of the Soviet Union, where things became more and more bureaucratized. And so the lesson we need to learn from that is like, if we're going to have a future economic and social system, which, whatever we want to call it, you can call it true socialism, whatever you like, but it has to be based on the actual bringing of the democratic planning process to something which actually embraces the working class, and the working class is constantly a part of. Because if we go back down the route of having bureaucratic diktats, however that emerged, and whatever historical conjunctions caused that, then we're going to recreate the same problem. So it has to be that economic planning in the future is truly democratic, which makes it more adaptable, which maybe means that it has to be debated longer, and you have to go further into an exhaustive discussion about a particular project or a particular sector of the economy. But given the advances in communications technology, it's not as if we're sending, bike couriers across the Urals region in the 1920s. We can get democratic debates and discussions going over modern communications technology very, very quickly now. So these are advantages that we have in terms of things that we've learned, in terms of the way that the technology has evolved. Going back to bureaucratic planning systems, I don't think that's going to sit well also with the democratic aspirations of workers in all states now. Because again, go back to the truckers' protest. The working class has fundamentally democratic aspirations for more control over their lives, the families' lives, the communities' lives. And that's what we have to embrace and base our approach on if we're ever going to get out of this mess.
So I just want to address something from the chat. Gene, I will ask about solutions, one of which is the climate crisis as the last question. But first, I do want to ask the panel here about the involvement of some of these countries we were just discussing in imperialism. We see some of these countries are involved in the World Economic Forum, extracting resources from other countries to further advance capitalism. We do see some of these Nordic countries selling weapons to the U.S., which is a collaboration with imperialism. So, what do you guys? What would you guys say about the role of these countries in imperialism? How vital is it to take these into account when people romanticize these countries?
Do you want to go first, or shall I?
Yeah, I can. So what I've kind of noticed in the weapons industry in general is quite often the countries that have a booming weapons industry often have certain types of regulations and benefits for the workers involved, right? And to kind of exemplify that, my local does most of its work with Department of Defense and Department of Energy. Department of Energy is just another arm of the Department of Defense, right? They handle nukes. So it's a way to funnel money into nuclear weapons. But I think that's kind of planned by design, right? To make your workforce more reactionary and more imperialist, because their whole well-being is based upon the weapons trade, right? And if they come to this conclusion that they're building something to kill other people, to kill innocent people on purpose for profit, then they will in effect be creating a pretext that they will lose their income and their well-being, right? Because when I joined the union, this was my first issue with it, is that my first dispatch was to Department of Defense, right? It was a national laboratory. So I think personally that anywhere where there's weapons trades, you have to have a social democratic type of system, right, to keep the workforce happy. It's right. It creates a subclass within a working class, if that makes sense. It creates a more privileged, right, a more privileged group of people that if they stand up against murdering people, innocent people, for profit, then they are in effect dropping their class down and won't be able to experience the same privileges that they used to. So that's kind of my take on the weapons trade between nations.
Well, the question of imperialism, and I mean, undoubtedly, like the Nordic countries are all engaged to one degree or another in American imperial adventures. Like, as I said before, Denmark contributed a fair amount of troops towards the occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. So they're all Denmark's in the NATO bloc. A lot of these countries are either in or around the European Union. These are all institutions which align them with the American-led bloc of imperialist nations. Again, like, this can't be disputed. This is just it's very much an established fact. The weapons trade is a key part of like modern imperialism, as is like the sending of like military advisors to resource-rich countries that they want to exploit the hell out of. You see, at the moment, the Malians are resisting the imposition of the French military in their country. And why is the French military there? Well, they want to get their hands on all the natural resources that Mali's sat on. And like for a lot of these countries, in like especially in sub-Saharan Africa, their attempt at breaking free from imperialism was crippled by the fact that they were, of course, still had to be integrated into the world economic system, dominated, of course, by American imperialism. The disappearance of the Soviet Union killed off any hope of even any kind of remotely alternative model. So a lot of these countries which got free of direct colonial occupation have just been turned right back around on their back, being exploited under a new form of colonialism. And also all the major capitalist nations, capitalism, no matter how you think you're practicing it, will become imperialism in the biggest countries, because what imperialism is based on is the need for constant expansion of profit, which means constant expansion of markets. You can't get all profits capitalism needs from domestic exploitation. That's true of the US. It'll ultimately be true if you're China as well. They won't be able to get around that particular issue, because imperialism isn't a thing that happens because some evil guy in London decides he wants to go and occupy India or Nigeria. It's a need of the system. The system needs new areas to exploit in terms of resources, in terms of labor, in terms of, and then once you've got those two considerations, then strategic competition with other imperialist powers. You know, why did Britain end up with occupying everywhere from Egypt in the north of Africa to Cape Town in the south? Because strategic positioning. We didn't want the French to have it, for some of it anyway, you know, which is, again, now you're starting to see a renewed scramble for Africa between the US through its military operations there. French are in on the game. The other European nations are partially involved. The British are involved. Chinese are involved now because they have a lot of capital being generated domestically, which needs to find an outlet. And that outlet is resource-rich areas in Africa. Now, a lot of my friends in the Marxist-Leninist world who are admirers of China don't want to admit that, say that it's like a US propaganda. But again, it is true. If you go down the route of the capitalist route, which they are, you're going to generate the need for imperialism. And that need has been generated in China now. Might not be that it's this running around blowing up nations like the US and the British are, because we're older imperialist powers in an advanced state of decay, and therefore they're getting more violent and more brutal in their attempt to seize control and maintain control. But it is going to happen. And you can say, oh, well, they're offering better deals now. They're going to be offering better deals when the US and Britain are further diminished in 10 years' time, when they're the dominant power. No. And it is not about evil individuals or things like that. It is about a need that is generated by capitalism itself. And nobody, no matter how clever he thinks he is, can find a way to circumvent that.
Right. So even if that one evil individual that people keep pointing to wasn't there, there would be another person there because of that need for imperialism with that system that we're in right now, right?
Yeah, like you can't get around this. Like, I'll use the example of World War One. Like, the ruling classes of Europe probably didn't want a 4-year war that led to the destruction of large numbers of their class, the overthrow of the Russian monarchy, the uprisings of the working class. They probably didn't want all that instability in summer of 1914, but the contradictions in the system pile up to the point where a violent, brutal release is all that is possible to resolve those contradictions. And even if you swapped out all the different leaders and put people of good men of conscience in place, they're still locked into a system of relationships inside that state and capitalist system, which means that they can't get out of that. If they won't do it, the next guy will. If the current CEO won't put lead in the water in Flint, Michigan or something, the next guy will. If the current governor of, say, some state in America where they're poisoning the water, take your pick, or in my country, if they're, not filling in mine shafts properly and causing fucking houses to fall into them or something, if that guy won't sign off on it, the next guy, or let's be fair, the next woman will, because this is the age of equality and women can be CEOs. Hillary Clinton told me so. So it's not about the individuals in the system matter to a certain degree, but they don't override the system. They can't. So it doesn't matter if you put 10, DSA members around the cabinet table for Joe Biden who were very sincere about making a welfare state. It wouldn't matter. They'd end up being imperialists anyway, as they have done over and over again. And that's the point I'd like to get across. Like, when you're in that system of bourgeois relationships, like, even if you took somebody out of it and told them and sat them down rationally saying, hey, look, what you're doing over here is going to impoverish millions and kill millions more, maybe they'd understand it. Then they go back into that system of relationships again. And then it's, well, if I don't do it, I'm ruined.
And because of the system and how it has this, these countries have to have this need for imperialism. Would this also include this need for surveillance of its people, this need for social credit systems? Someone in the chat just asked about social credit scores in, I believe in China, and now what the U.S. is trying to engender here, in which they're trying to use one avenue with the COVID situation, trying to install passports, vaccine passports, and digital IDs. Is there some need for this also because of the system that we have?
Well, on the ID question, they've wanted like more control over people's lives essentially for a very long time. We had the idea of the ID card here in Britain's been kicking around for over 30 years. Various politicians have tried to bring it in. What all of that you've just described is a product of the fact that, first of all, at root, the system's becoming more unstable. They know it's becoming more unstable, and their ever increasing bureaucratization and authoritarianism of the state is a reflection of that economic instability at its root. Now, the politicians at the top might not understand why they're doing these things, or might not even know, because a lot of these things exist in state bureaucracies which are not subject to even the scrutiny that a capitalist politician was subjected to. But these processes have been in place and have been running continuously for at least 30 years. And that's why, like, unless you get a huge pushback against this, like, for example, our Canadian trucker friends doing at the moment, then the system is on an autopilot to get more authoritarian, more bureaucratic, less democratic every year. And every crisis that comes up, they're going to use that as an opportunity to actually increase the pace of that. And that's what's going on every time we get a crisis. We saw it with so-called war on terror, your beloved Patriot Act, all the power to the surveillance state that came out of that never stopped here either. And we got our first anti-terrorism legislation even before 9/11. So this is just a process that is running. They are seeking to make dissent borderline criminal, if not outright criminal. We have so many terrorism acts in this country that even if you're a worker taking strike action, they can call you a terrorist because you're disrupting public infrastructure. We've got systems in place. We've got something called the Prevent Act here, which tells teachers and medical professionals that if they see a patient or a service user who is displaying signs of radicalization, you've got to inform the police or inform people higher up the chain. Again, these are all processes inside state bureaucracies which are running permanently because a lot of interests that are linked to it. At root, I'll just conclude on this point, is the instability of the system itself. On one level, the people doing this are aware that their system is becoming more unstable and rotten. And their response is, well, we've got to increase the power of the state. We've got to increase the power of the state. The positive side of that is that ultimately, if the working class gets organized enough and moves quickly enough, that can all be rendered impotent. To borrow a phrase from Marx, you can suspend the state in midair if all the people below, enough people below it, just say no.
Yeah, what are your thoughts, Shadowban, on digital IDs and everything? Is this a product of neoliberalism, a product of just any economic theory that we had in place? What would you say?
Well, I think it's kind of a rational conclusion. Like I have a tendency to rationalize everything, right? And I try to take anything to its logical conclusion, right? Like I try to think of it as like a chess kind of deal. Like if I move this piece, then I'm going to have to move this piece, and then I'm going to have to move this piece, and I'm going to have to move this piece, and I'm going to have to do it in this fucking sequence of events. So like, I mean, the empire always comes home, right? And we live in a world of unempire, right? Dominated by capital interests, of course. And so the digital ID is creating a new market out of thin air, right? There's no real hard resources to that other than you, like in your data, right? Like how can you be atomized down to the clicks that you do and the things that you say, right? It's kind of like it's the social engineering component of it is how do I make you a more functional number on my balance sheet, right? Because I mean, the social credit score serves no one except for the state and capital in its symbiotic function, right? And as we move forward with this fourth industrial revolution, right? This reorganizing of states and capital into one fluid motion rather than competing interests. They're going to have to they're going to have to find their new market to accumulate off of in us, because they've ran out of markets, right? There's nothing left to take. They've basically there's no new innovation as they always talk about, right? So it's kind of dubious, I guess, but it's really a logical conclusion of the worshiping of capital and atomizing how much are you worth to me, right? And like that's how currency is going to be rolled out as well as CBDCs, right? Depending on your social credit score, how much is your digital dollar going to be worth tomorrow? Did you say the right thing? And if you said the wrong thing, then you're only going to be able to buy an apple rather than 2 or 3 apples, which the good boys are allowed. So it's just a new market for them to make us part of and compete with each other when they pull the strings behind it in the first place, right? They engineered that market, but we're going to be expected to compete within it.
I want to address some donations here. Thank you very much, Bubblegum Douche. And the Convo Couch just donated. They said, holy shit, my 3 favorite people in one place. Good morning, y'all. Pasta. The Shadow Band and Alexander share the same barber. Wow.
All great men have facial hair. What can I say?
Yeah. Yeah, so take that, Pasta. You lack a beard and you're jealous. So with the climate crisis, with the ramping up of more surveillance, more control over the people, what would you guys say, in addition to helping to elevate human consciousness, improving the human mind, what would be the ideal economic solution to all these problems that we're facing in the world?
Well, to start on a basic level, look, capitalism, and my attitude stems from Marx on this, like unleashes a lot of potential, but the old point, and the one that is still valid, is that the private ownership of these huge new technologies limits their potential, and also doesn't actually help human development further. It helps you to the point where you can be exploited for your labor. It doesn't actually develop further than that, and that's the fundamental limitation on all this so-called innovation that they keep unleashing. So we need a system whereby, like, we can take that basis which capitalism has given us, a lot of these advanced technologies which would make things like, as I was saying earlier, modern communications technology makes rational democratic economic planning a lot more possible than it was 100 years ago on a global basis. But I'll start off with like a couple of practical things that I would say would be useful to everybody to think about on just on the day-to-day, which is that we need to look at like ways in which we can build up the power and the confidence of the working class in every nation of itself as a class. And what I mean by that is that there's been a concerted attempt for, well, really 30 years or more to atomize the working class, to dissolve the bonds of social solidarity, and to make everybody feel like an isolated individual. We need to find some way of actually, again, Canadian truckers have found it in a way, like bringing people back together to take collective action in a way which can directly impact upon the profit-making abilities of the ruling class. And that's not an easy thing to do. But without that knowledge, without the working class gaining the knowledge of itself as a class that can affect the world and have a real world impact politically, then we're not going to go very far. And that means having adaptive tactics, in my view. Sometimes it'll take the form of a strike, sometimes it'll take the form of a blockade, sometimes it'll take the form of like maybe a localized run for office. It can help boost the confidence of the working class in a particular area. But one thing we can't do is try and tell people that electing people to this system that we've got at the moment is going to be a way out, because it's not. At best, it's a temporary expedient tactic in certain situations, not the solution to anything. The solution is like bringing through both political education and practical action the level of consciousness to the point where ordinary people can start to see that they can manage the lives of themselves, their families, their communities through democratic action. And that takes political organization across local, regional, and national dimensions. But that's where we've got to start. The aim has got to be that consciousness raising through both educational and practical action. And the aim ultimately is, for me, that we move beyond, we've been discussing the state a lot, we move beyond the idea of the state as it has been constructed in the capitalist period to what used to be referred to as just simply the administration of things, or the democratic administration of things. And this is where we need to be evolving our thinking towards. I'm not going to try and give like a roadmap here, because that's not, that's not a right that I have to tell people where this is going to go. But I am going to say that that is my idea of what we can do to get towards that. And this get away from this endless repetition of the 20th century, which I don't know if I think we've all noticed by now, ended in a lot of failures. Let's learn the lesson, and let's evolve to get towards that point where workers can actually rule.
I actually really appreciate that you say that about it's not your place to it's not your place to tell people what the roadmap is, because I try to say that all the time too, right? There's always this, well, what's your plan? It's like, well, it's not my place to dictate what the plan to move forward is, right? With regards to like a revolutionary working class, like I sympathize with it, but I'm not quite sure if I necessarily agree with it anymore, right? Because a lot of experiences I've had with people that are business owners, right? And they would be exploiting labor. They're not necessarily bad guys, right? I think like at an ecological level, how to address the climate crisis, right? With the rise of climate change and global warming, or whatever it's called now. I don't know what it's called now, if it's still climate change or whatever. Everyone kind of forgot about pollution for some reason. As one of our friends, Glory, always brings up, deep sea mining is a fucking issue, a serious issue. And
environmental destruction, the sea, all these habitats, and those directly affect us and our health. We're putting that stuff in our bodies.
Absolutely. And like, in my background is I worked in oil and gas, right? I was part of that machine that poisoned people for profit. It's kind of what led me down the path of wondering why these things happen. But like, at a municipal level, what is good for me and my neighbors, and what is good for the dude across town? Like, I don't really think that it's my place to tell someone in fucking Dallas or in DC or in Miami or whatever what their path forward needs to be, right? And I think it's becoming removed from face-to-face interaction that we end up with most of our problems, right? It's like you can detach yourself mentally and spiritually from another human being, and it just looks like it's an abstraction, right? And we're removed from that when we don't have a concept of municipal power. And it's kind of funny because the Marxists call me an anarchist or an anarchitty, and then the anarchists call me a bootlicker. But I'm also not opposed to like face-to-face democracy. Like if democratic institutions need to be used to actualize the goals that we have, I'm not opposed to like a municipal democratic operation, right? And municipal ecological operation. Stuff that Murray Bookchin would talk about, right? Because for the most part, a lot of ecological destruction comes from manufactured scarcity, right? Like oil and gas, it's a manufactured it's scarce because it's been manufactured to be scarce, right? And I think that's a lot of the reason why nuclear technology has been pushed, because it's a scarce thing and you need like this big operation to do it. And I don't consider it safe at all, because all it takes is one whoopsie. Fukushima taught us that. And then, of course, before that, it was Chernobyl and all those other issues with atomic energy. But like, how do we solve the climate crisis? That's up to each and every single municipality, right? Like, I think we can't ask for a global system to fix that for us. I think on a decentralized basis, we could do something about it, and it could actually fix things a lot faster than having it go up the chain of bureaucracy and then down the chain of bureaucracy and then back up again until they find a solution, right? And there's a lot of capital interest along the way when it becomes a global thing. So decentralization is kind of how I look at ecology in general.
Yeah, well said, guys. I would definitely want to have you guys back on again. I learned a lot from you guys. And to so, are there any final messages you guys want to leave the audience with? Anywhere you guys want to plug? Anything you guys want to plug in of where people can find you and your body of work?
Well, if you want to hear more from me, I'm going to be do two podcasts a week on Red Star Radio. You can find the account on Twitter and pick it up from there, or you can find me under AR Mackay82 on Twitter. Going to be doing some more writing this week on the state of the trade union movement in Britain. There might be some lessons there from that for your American experience as well. And going to be doing more on the live stream side in the near future as we head towards what I call the renewal of the 2008 recession coming right up. So thanks for the invite today, and it's been a really good discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Polly?
Yeah, so me and my partner, we're working on launching our own little platform of things. But for now, you can find me on Medium, Shadowband Refugee. You can find me on Twitter, Shadowband_R, I want to say. I'm here and there, but yeah, I mean, final remarks is I'm not a rigid ideologue here, man. Like, I really enjoyed my conversation with Alex. He's a wealth of knowledge. Like, very, very fucking intelligent man. So like, this was fun, dude. This was a blast.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been great. It's like one thing that being in the labor union movement here taught me was like the most rigid and hysterical people are often the ones who will sell out the quickest, and that's been my experience. So and also like there needs to be a degree of humility on everybody's part. Like political judgments are made and you get them wrong. I certainly was wrong, so I'm prepared to discuss with anybody who's like sincere about wanting the power of the working class to be grown in a mass democratic way. If anybody who's into that, we can have an interesting discussion. Or people who are sincerely opposed to it, you can have an interesting discussion there as well. It's like it doesn't have to be the way in which it's been portrayed to us, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I really like this comment right here. Class solidarity, right? That's what we got to have more of these conversations and have some understandings and realize that this is a top bottom issue and not a left right issue, right? So thank you guys very much again. I thought this was an excellent conversation, and to everybody else, you're not alone, and I know you'll stay informed.
Thanks, everybody.